Hello, everyone. It's great to be here at TEDx in Washington, where actually I'm, as mentioned, still a little bit of an anomaly. I actually has been in business longer than I've been in politics. Before I was governor or senator, I was actually an entrepreneur. I started a lot of businesses, actually failed at a number of them as well, but then got lucky enough back in the early 80s to get involved in the very beginnings of the cell phone business. Now, how many of you remember these? I'm going to actually go against the rules of TEDx and say, even when I'm speaking, go ahead and leave your cell phones on, because when you hear an annoying sound, I actually hear cha-ching, cha-ching, because I was the co-founder of Nextel. So I got to tell you, my daughters always say, Dad, you were cool back in the early 80s. That was so long ago. But one of the things that's remarkable about that cell phone breakthrough, I could never imagine that those would ultimately become these, and that we can actually carry more information, more computing power in this phone than what was on the lunar landing module. That actually you can access more information with this device than our parents and our grandparents could access in their whole lifetime. Because of the innovation that's been driven by this kind of technology, combined with GPS, we're seeing a dramatic transformation that's taking place in the notion of how and where we work. And that's what I want to talk about today. Unfortunately, I work in a place that is basically a 19th century institution with 20th century rules, particularly rules about how we get things done, but we all live in a 21st century economy where nobody waits for policy and politics to get it right. But let me talk about how this cell phone, combined with GPS and a whole lot of algorithmic modeling, is changing the nature of work. My dad, who will turn 90 in a few days, is actually a classic example of that generation. He came back from the Second World War. He started work fairly soon after that, worked for the same company for 40 years. Now, he never rose too high in that company, but working in that company, there was a social contract. He got decent pay, he got a retirement plan, he had a defined set of benefits. And now in retirement, even though he complains, he's got a predictable future. Then my generation came along, the baby boomers, and things started to move. We started to see globalization. We were quickly joined by the Gen Xers. And we changed from working in a single job to 3 or 4 jobs. And the nature of the social contract with our employers changed. We no longer had a pension plan. We had a 401k. But for the most part, many of the other benefits, unemployment, workman's comp, disability, still were part of the social contract. Now we've got this moment where the millennials are coming in, 83 million strong. They've completely made the baby boomers yesterday's news. They will actually make up the majority of the workforce within a decade. And they are working in a social and work environment where a lot of the whole notion of the social contract, because of the changes brought about by technology, are totally changing. So we thought about my dad's generation. They were the belt and suspenders generation. They had all the support. My generation, the baby boomers, well, we were maybe the belt generation. The millennials, they got to hold their own pants up. And that is a radical transformation that I'm not sure most of the folks in this town fully understand. How have this change come about? Well, it's come about because we've seen a giant growth in contingent workers. We've seen the ability to take that phone, combined with GPS, and monetize your time, your car, your apartment, in ways that were fundamentally different. At the same time, we're seeing our corporate culture change dramatically as more and more businesses are driven towards short-term, quarterly profits. They don't see investment in people as that necessary asset that was seen in the past. So we've got the advent of something that quite honestly doesn't even have a full name at this point. The gig economy, the sharing economy, the on-demand economy, the 1099 workforce. And this is swinging into our world in a way that's totally unprecedented, an area where we don't have good data, and frankly is changing the whole notion of work. What I've found as I go around and talk to folks in this community, that what brings folks to this changing nature of work are a variety of factors. A number of people, post-recession, are taking on this additional gig, or renting out their house Airbnb, or driving, an Uber to make sure they supplement income that hasn't kept up post-2008. A whole other series of folks are actually doing this because of economic necessity and are having to cobble together 2, 3, 4 different gigs to try to make ends meet. And finally, there's a whole group of folks, unprecedented, I think, in modern history, that are actually leaping into this by choice. They're saying it's no longer a question of where do you work, but it's much more a question of what you're working on. And quite honestly, that is something that Washington or the state or the local government really doesn't understand or totally get. So how do we go about it? What are we seeing that's coming from this change? I travel around the state, have been meeting with folks all across Virginia, just came back from San Francisco as well, meeting with many of the platform companies. And there's a couple of things that I've noted. One, policymakers, quite honestly, as we think about the social contract, as we think about traditional benefits, we can't put a price or a real value from a policy standpoint on freedom and flexibility. So many people are choosing to make this leap into this gig economy, are doing it because they love to have the freedom, they love to have the flexibility, catch their kids' game, schedule their life on their schedule rather than on employer schedule. So that notion of freedom and flexibility is something I think from a policy standpoint we have to think through. Second is that we are seeing that this is not just happening with the millennials. I was down in Roanoke recently, and most of the folks who are in the gig economy were actually 40, 50, 60 years old. Many of them had come to it from dislocation. But what they'd come to, when they got there, they actually realized they loved it. In every conversation I've had with folks working in this changing economy, none of them would go back to a traditional 9-to-5 job at their same salary. It takes close to 30 to 40% increase in their current pay for them to consider going back to what we would call a traditional job. Third, there is a challenge because combined with this flexibility, there is also huge economic uncertainty. Recent data showed that for the average American family, 60% of the American families, if they got hit with a $500 bill, they'd have to borrow money or go into bankruptcy. Think about that for a moment. That is because, again, many of the traditional social programs that we've had don't apply to this changing workforce. In many ways, people can be doing extraordinarily well in this gig sharing and on-demand economy, way up here on a tight wire. But when the stuff hits the fan, as it always does, they go from here down to being back on the government dime in terms of social basic assistance programs because none of the things that used to catch you along the way, that unemployment program, that workman's comp, that disability, exist. And increasingly I'm finding, I remember sitting down with a number of Etsy workers. They all loved having this opportunity to make things and sell things over the internet. But they all say, my gosh, many of them were jewelry makers. If I hurt my hands, I have nothing to fall back on. So how do we think through these challenges? Two other things I've found. One, Obamacare, love it or hate it. But in many ways, what has made the gig or on-demand or sharing economy possible is the fact that we have disconnected healthcare from your employment, which then allows you to go ahead and take a series of risks that before people weren't able to do. And from a good standpoint, what I've found is that many of these companies, the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Airbnbs, the TaskRabbits, the Handys, these platforms actually do want to do the right thing. They do want to get to a place where they treat their workforce with respect. But unfortunately, with this 20th century regulatory model, with a political system that, frankly, tries to divide everything into liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, they can't have the freedom right now to try different models going forward because the regulatory environment doesn't allow it. So this means where in my current day job do we step in? First, here's what I think we've got to sort through. Right now, our current economy basically has only two ways to classify folks who work. You're either employed or you're an independent contractor. Somebody who drives 10 hours a month on Uber, rents out their apartment a couple times a month on Airbnb, does a few tasks, and then sells stuff over Etsy. What are they? We have no way to define in our current employment classifications, which has basically got two models, what that person is. So, from a policy standpoint, we've got to think and lean forward into this opportunity. Here's some suggestions that I'm looking at. Could we take the exchange model that the healthcare reform put in place and say, maybe we could have an exchange model for benefits in the 21st century, where you could go out and shop for a different unemployment plan or workman's comp plan or disability plan. Might be a way to provide a marketplace, and it may be a private sector model rather than a public sector model providing the benefit. Second, if you've got a series of revenue streams coming from a variety of different sources, maybe we can actually borrow an idea from the past and apply it in the 21st century. If you were a member of the Carpenters Union back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, they had a tool called an hour bank. You might work for 10 different contractors over a year. Some of those might be legitimate, some of them might not be illegitimate, but what would happen is every time you did a job, the employer would chip in a little bit, you'd chip in a little bit. It would be a portable benefit that would actually be managed by an independent third party. This was called the hour bank. In the 20th century model, it was the union, but in the 21st century model, this notion of aggregating a little bit of shared, putting resources aside in terms of a social benefit, might be something that we'd explore that would have your ability to aggregate revenues from different sources. Maybe we can even think broader than the old models. Maybe we could even have a consumer model. Maybe if you drive that, get a ride in that Uber, instead of giving a gratuity, you'd actually put in something that might be matched by the platform company, again, into some third-party managed social welfare, social benefit fund. The notion is, though, we've got to think about a way to get this right, number one. Number two, we also realize, and what I found, particularly seeing a lot of these companies in the last week out in San Francisco, while normally they say, oh my gosh, Washington, stay away, stay away. And if we come in too quickly, for example, with a third classification, before we try out different models, we could mess up one of the most innovative parts of our economy. But what they also realize, if we end up litigating this in 50 different states, in 10,000 different cities around America, that's not going to get it right as well. And the third thing is, we've got to recognize that government at every level is frankly not as nimble, not as forward-leaning as it needs to be. And if we're going to make sure that this innovative gig on-demand economy actually works, we've got to recognize that government has to be more flexible than a kind of one-size-fits-all approach that we've taken in the past. That's going to also mean that policies that are kind of secondary at this point actually gets more focus. For example, broadband deployment. It's great to be part of the gig economy if you live in Southside Virginia, but you can't be part of that gig economy if you don't have access to broadband. We've got to recognize as well that one of the things that's holding back this millennial generation, which is the most diverse, most educated, most willing to see technology disruption, is that they are burdened with now $1.3 trillion of student debt in a way that doesn't allow them to realize their dreams. I think about the fact as the first member of my family to graduate from college, I came out with student debt, but it was manageable enough that I would have, if I'd had the numbers that people come out today, I would have never tried that cell phone business because I would have, after I failed my first two businesses, I'd be back to work in a normal job. So how we think about issues that move forward innovation and move forward opportunity have to be higher on the agenda. Final comments are this. One, this transformation is something that is coming whether we like it or not. We don't even have good data on it. The size of the gig economy, some have estimated as small as 3 million, Some have estimated in terms of all contingent workers, 53 million, a third of our workforce. Second is we've got 20 people running for president, and nobody is thinking through these kind of issues that are fundamentally affecting people's lives. The cool opportunity and the chance that we ought to move from the TEDx conversations into the policy sphere is this question of how we get work and the social contract right in the 21st century. We have an opportunity to not make this a traditional left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, but frame this whole conversation in a future versus past. If we do that, we present dramatic opportunity. What I don't think we're going to do, and what I'm not proposing, and I've been out asking questions, I don't propose or say that I've got the absolute answer today, but I do know this, that if we get it right, if we pose this as future versus past, if we recognize that whether we like it or not, this innovation is going to continue and frankly move at an exponentially growth rate, we have an opportunity to take advantage of some of the growth that was provided and flexibility that was provided back with the advent of telecommunications and give people the kind of lifestyles they choose, but also give folks the tool for the kind of upward economic mobility that, quite honestly, hasn't been available as often as we'd like over the last decade. Now, that's a challenge that if we do it right, maybe even Congress can't screw up. But we got to get it right. Thank you all very much.